We have the last chapter, chapter 24 to finish, and we're going to do that this week and next. It's a very interesting chapter. I'm going to start by reading the first 10 verses, and then we'll start taking that apart, okay? The anger of the Lord again flared up against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go and number Israel, or go and count Israel and Judah." The king said to Joab, his army commander, "Make the rounds of all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, and take a census of the people, so that I may know the size of the population." Joab answered the king, "May the Lord your God increase the number of the people 100-fold, while your own eyes see it. But why should my lord king want this?" However, the king's command to Joab and to the officers of the army remained firm. And Joab and the officers of the army set out at the instance of the king to take a census of the people of Israel. They crossed the Jordan and encamped at Aroer on the right side of the town, which is in the middle of the Valley of Gad, and went on to Yazer. They continued to Gilead into the region of Tachtim Hodshi, and they came to Dan Yan and around to Sidon. They went unto the fortress of Tyre and all the towns of the Hivites and the Canaanites, and finished at Beersheba in southern Judah. They traversed the whole country, and then they came back to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. Joab reported to the king the number of the people that had been recorded. In Israel, there were 800,000 soldiers ready to draw the sword, and the men of Judah numbered 500,000. But afterward, David reproached himself for having counted the people. And David said to the Lord, "I have sinned grievously in what I have done. Please, O Lord, remit the guilt of your servant, for I have acted foolishly." Okay, so we see here it's a little bit odd. The chapter begins that God again is angry at the nation of Israel. And or he continued to be angry, or he's angry again. And it's a little odd. Again, like all the last chapters in the book of Samuel, it's not clear when this happened. But we don't see much, if at all, really, in the book of Samuel, that God is angry at Israel. God is angry at David. God is angry at Saul. But, angry at Israel, that's number one. Number two, as a result of that anger, he incites David. Now here, the way it's translated, I take issue with. It says he incited David against them. It doesn't really say that in the Hebrew. I would translate it, he incited David with regard to them. Okay? It's not that he is having David doing something against the nation, but he has David doing something he shouldn't be doing, okay, with regard to the nation. And what is that thing? It seems, from the context, to count the nation of Israel. So right off at the end, the rest of this goes on with, we can see that this counting is clearly problematic because Yoav himself doesn't want to do it. He says, I hope that the nation increases forever, but why do we have to count them? Why are you making me do this? And David says, I don't care, you're doing it. And so he does it to obey the king. And then he has a whole long census, and the census takes almost 10 months. And we have the number. And if you'll notice at the end of verse 9, he's counting essentially the military. He's counting all men who are of military age and capability. And in fact, at the end, he's calling them soldiers, 800,000 soldiers, and men of Judah, 500,000. So these are not just counting how many people. It's not a population census. It's a military census. How many people? Not necessarily, they didn't have a standing army. They had men who they would call upon to come and fight as the need arose. And this is how many he had to call upon. And of course, in verse 10, we see that David realizes he made a mistake. And he sinned, and he shouldn't have done it. So the first question is, what was the sin? And the second question is, why is God inciting David to sin. That's a little bit odd. You okay? Very odd, in fact. Okay. Now I'm going to add something else into the mix. As with much of the book of Samuel, there is a parallel chapter in the book of Chronicles with one significant difference that we're going to focus on. This is in Chronicles 1, First Chronicles, chapter 21. And we're just going to read the first verse because that's what we're talking about that's different. And again, First Chronicles chapter 21, verse 1. Satan rose against Israel and incited David to count Israel, to number Israel. Satan. Now, there's no mention of a Satan in our chapter. And in our chapter, it says, God is angry, and he incited David. Although I must say, it doesn't say who incited, it's a pronoun, and he incited. But the assumption is from the verse that if the beginning of the verse is talking about God, that the continuation is talking about God, if you have a pronoun. Okay, and then suddenly you have Satan. So, I think before we get to the other questions, which in many ways is more difficult, I want to deal with the Satan thing. And just give a little insight and a place where I think there's actually differences in the perception of Satan between Jews and Christians. So first of all, where is it that we have the word Satan in the Bible? It's almost not at all in the Hebrew scriptures, very, very few places. So
Job.
the first place that we see the word Satan is in the book of Numbers, chapter 22. Numbers 22, verse 22. We're in the middle of the story of Balaam, and Balaam is at a point at which God has already told Balaam, don't go with these men who've come to you to curse Israel. I'm not going to let you curse them. And despite that, he gets on his donkey and he goes. And in verse 22, it says as follows. But God was incensed at his going. So an angel of the Lord placed himself in his way. Okay, so here in the English, it says as an adversary. But that's really not the translation. He placed himself in his way to obstruct him, to be an obstruction to him. An adversary sounds like they're about to have a debate, okay? It's not to have a debate. It's to block his way, to be an obstruction or to be an interruption, okay? The word there, adversary, what is in your translations for that? Placed himself in his way.
Yeah, we've got adversary in the King James Version.
Adversary, okay.
That's the Satanas.
What do you have, Joyce? Also adversary?
American Standard says adversary also.
Okay, so adversary can be a word, but it's the word that's used here is Satan, Satan, the word, but it's not as a figure. Okay, it's either a verb or a noun, but a noun that describes an action. Okay, so it's to be to block him, to interrupt him. I think adversary is a bad word, and I think the adversary is affected. The word adversary is affected by the way it's used later on in the Bible. In this case, and it's true. What do we know? That he can't move. What happens? He puts this angel, and he's standing there, not to have a conversation, to block his way. That's what he's doing. He's standing there so that Balaam can no longer move forward with his donkey. Okay. Now let's go to of a very, very similar use of the word in 1 Kings, which we have not yet read, but we will soon. 1 Kings chapter 11, 14. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 14. We're talking about Solomon. And we have at the beginning, we start listening to some of the sins, some of the problems that Solomon has. He has all these wives and all that stuff. That's the context. And so we have here God getting involved. And what does he do? On verse 14, again, we have this adversary. So the Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon, the Edomite Hadad, who was of the royal family of Edom. So again, this Satan, it's the word here for adversary is Satan, but it's not Satan, it's Satan, whatever. And again, you might say this could be adversary, but it's more like someone who's going to cause a problem. Is a problem. In other words, he is going to take this guy, Hadad Edomi, and he's putting him before Solomon as a problem, as an interruption, as somebody who's going to cause trouble. Okay? So it's a similar use. It's a disturbance, okay? In the same way as that angel is a disturbance to Balaam, this Hadad is going to be a disturbance. He will be an adversary. The nature of his disturbance will be as an adversary because he's going to go to war with him. But the point is that he's going to be blocking his path to whatever he's been doing until now. Okay. But in none of these cases are we talking about the word Satan as Satan as we very often envision it, which is an image, is a person. Well, not necessarily a person, but a entity, a something, a someone, a Satan who may have a personality, who may have a will, who may have a function. Okay, that's not what it is in these two original things. Where do we have a different kind of Satan? Well, one was in First Chronicles that we just read, which is the First Chronicles version of this story, where actually there seems to be a Satan who is doing something, a Satan who comes to incite David. And this starts to sound more like a Satan that we think about, Satan, or a devil. Okay, when someone says, the devil made me do it, right? It's that kind of thing. You've got this Satan there that is pushing you to do something that you may ordinarily not do. It sounds like that's the case. Now, we have another example of that, and that is in the book of Job. Well, there's a couple. Okay, first of all, in the book of Job, chapter 1, and this I'm sure you are all familiar with this how the story begins in Job. Job begins with this heavenly court. God has his angels around him, including Satan. And this is in Job chapter 1, verse 7. The Lord said to it's interesting. Here it also says the adversary. Lord said to the adversary, where have you been? But here the adversary is capitalized. Interesting. The adversary answered the Lord, I have been roaming all over the earth. The Lord said to the adversary, have you noticed my servant Job? Blah, blah, blah. Verse 9, the adversary answered the Lord, does Job not have good reason to fear God? Why does you have fenced him round him? Okay, basically, what do we have here? Here in Job, for the first time, you have Satan as a figure who is basically acting as what we would call a prosecutor, pushing the negative about somebody, going to God and saying, you like Job, you're wrong. Let me tell you about, why don't you test Job? Job really isn't what you think he is, okay? So he's serving the job. If you picture a court, a regular court, okay, you've got the prosecuting attorney and the defense attorney. So the prosecuting attorney is going to show up all the bad stuff about somebody, and the defense attorney is going to defend him. So in this sense, you have the Satan serving as the prosecuting attorney in this heavenly court where there are angels around God, and then there's this Satan who's saying, no, you see, Job is really not good. We're going to test him. You'll see. In other words, the effectiveness, I'm going to cross-examine him. You're going to see what it really is. Okay. But that's like the role there. We have another reference in a similar way. Zechariah, chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 1. And here we're in the middle of a vision, one of Zechariah's vision. He's got lots of those. And he says as follows, he further showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord and the accuser. Okay, now what do you have in yours? This is again the same word. This is Satan.
Yeah,
But
Satan.
here, what?
Yes, Satan.
Okay, so in my translation, it's called the accuser, which is the same thing as like the prosecuting attorney or whatever. The accuser standing at his right to accuse him. And in Hebrew, it's the Satan standing on his right, and the verb of to accuse is from the root Satan. Okay? Okay, so what I would like to suggest, and I'm not making this up, is that first of all, it is only from the Second Temple period. Now, we don't really know when Job was written. It's very possible there's also a later book written during the Second Temple period, and this may be one of the proofs that it was written later. I mean, there's nothing in Job that attaches it to any single historical date of any kind. There's no historical figures, there's no historical occurrences. It could be a parable that happened at any time, essentially, okay? But the language that it is used, for example, the use of Satan, Satan as a figure, as opposed to an action, it may date it to the Second Temple period. Both Zechariah and Chronicles are books in the Second Temple period. Okay, so I think from there, and I think that's really where Christianity comes in, because there's no question in Christian sources, Satan becomes not only an accuser, playing a role. See, in Judaism, okay, I'll get to that in a second. It's not just an accuser with a particular role. Satan becomes a powerful figure. It becomes a figure with its own power that has the ability to bring evil or that represents evil in the world. Okay. Now, in Judaism, we do not see Satan as an independent power because all power comes from God. So there is evil in the world. God created evil. He created human beings with the potential to do evil. That is the nature of choice. We have the freedom of choice. We can say, I'm going to do good or I'm going to do evil. If God hadn't created the potential for evil, there would be no choice. You would just be good and we'd all be boring. But that's so we see Satan not as an independent force, not as an entity, not as an image, but as a representation of the force of evil. And it can also be a representation of the temptation within a human being that draws him to do evil. And that very much connects with the connection between this story in the end of 2 Samuel and the story as it is presented in Chronicles. Because what Chronicles is doing is taking the same idea. If indeed we say Satan is not an independent power, but it is a force, it's a temptation, it's your evil temptation, then what basically Chronicles is saying, he's saying what happens in verse 1. How do we represent the fact that God tempted David? We give him a figure that I guess was known as a representation of that temptation in the Second Temple period. They call him Satan. But Satan, again, is just an expression of God when he's acting in this way. And I would say similar in Job. Job, it's not so, it is an accuser, or you can say a tempter, but in other words, what God is doing in Job, God sets up this court, okay? He himself is giving the various angels the ability to represent. I mean, if God didn't want these things to happen to Job, it wouldn't have happened, right? God is setting it forward. And did it ever happen? I don't know if Job ever happened, but it certainly is there to get us going and think of all these things we're supposed to think about after we read Job, and we're not studying Job, but I'm sure you're aware of it. But excuse me. But you have this idea of the defender and the accuser, okay? So in that sense, the accuser is not as much of the tempter, but it fills a similar role in creating the ability for evil, okay? By creating this choice, okay? So that's just what I just wanted to say about this idea of Satan. I don't think that there's literally a Satan in the story, but I think that there's definitely a temptation and the temptation to do wrong that comes from God. And if we don't understand that in Chronicles, we certainly understand it here, because in our book, it says very clearly the source is God. It's God that issues the temptation. So when we put this out of the way, now we have the much bigger question. Why would God tempt somebody to sin? And before we get to that question, we have to really understand what's the sin. What was the problem here? Okay, so in order to understand the sin, let's go back to the book of Numbers, where we have instructions about counting the nation. Okay, so that is in Numbers 30, chapter 1, verse 1. Numbers 30, verse 1. No, it's not number 30. Excuse me. Number 30, verse 11. I didn't see the other one. Okay. Numbers 30, verse 11. Lord spoke to Moses, saying, when you take a census of the Israelite people according to their enrollment, each shall pay the Lord a ransom for himself on being enrolled, that no plague may come upon them through their being enrolled or counted. I'm just what it says. This is what everyone who is entered in the record shall pay: a half a shekel by the sanctuary weight, 20 gerahs to the shekel. A half shekel is an offering to the Lord. Everyone who is entered in the records from the age of 20 years up shall give the Lord's offering. The rich shall not pay more, and the poor shall not pay less than half a shekel when giving the Lord's offering as expiation for your persons. You shall take the expiation money from the Israelites, assign it to the service of the tent of meeting. It shall serve the Israelites as a
Sondra,
reminder before the Lord as expiation for your persons.
have you got the right reference?
Pardon?
It's not 30.
It's not 30
Numbers.
verses.
Oh, not Numbers. Exodus. I'm so sorry. I
Oh,
keep getting mixed up with the words. Numbers 30, not Numbers.
Exodus.
Exodus 30, because I'm thinking numbers. I'm thinking counting. No, Exodus 30, verse 11. Okay, I'm sorry. What is
Answer
going
that.
on here?
Don't worry.
God says, when you count the people, don't count their heads, count their coins. Everybody has to give a half a shekel. The half a shekel itself will be used for the temple. Okay? It says you assign it to the service of the tent of meeting, meaning it's be used for the work of the temple. Okay? But this is how you count. You take a census, each shall pay this amount of money. So basically what happens is every adult, and later on we have how many people they are, it's men from the age of 20 to 50, I believe. It is men of military age, and each one puts down a half a shekel, and they count that, okay? And here it says very clearly that no plague may come upon them through their being counted, okay? There's an issue here that if you're going to count without this half a shekel, you will bring plague upon the nation. Now, this is odd, very odd. People say, well, maybe it's the evil eye. There's all kinds of explanations. Regardless of the explanations, this is what's going on. God says, if you don't do it with a half a shekel, you're going to have a plague, okay? And this is indeed how they did it, how they counted. Now, they had a few different, also in Numbers, they count the nation twice at the beginning of the book, at the end of the book. And at the beginning of the book, there's a count, and the understanding is, at that point, we don't know yet that there's going to be the sin of the spies in the middle of the book. But at the beginning of Numbers, we assume that they're now getting ready to go to the land of Israel and to conquer it. So when they count at the beginning, your assumption is they're counting to see what kind of an army we're going to put together, because we're going to get ready to march. And in chapter 11, they're getting ready to march, and then everything falls apart. Okay. At the end of the book of Numbers, you have another count, because it is after the sins and after various plagues, and especially the last one, the sin at Baal Peor. And so lots of people have died. And now it is in the 40th year. They're about to go into the land. So you've had people born. If you had people killed, it's 40 years later. So you need to have another count to see now what your army is. Okay. So what you see in this case, number one, we learned from Exodus that you don't count heads, you count coins. And you learn from Numbers that in each case that they have this national census, it was for a very practical reason. You need an army. You need to know how many people you have, and who's who, and where do they all live, and what tribes do they belong to, etc. So when Jewish commentaries look at this situation of David, they notice, number one, that there's absolutely no mention of a half a coin, half a shekel. And so they say, could it be? And at the end, we haven't gotten to the end yet, but at the end, we have that the punishment that comes upon the nation as a result of this census is a plague. So they make that connection and they say he must have goofed and not counted the right way. If he had counted with the half a shekel, then there wouldn't be a plague. There would be no sin. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, there's a few ways of looking at it, but these are the two basic ways. Others are kind of, ramifications of similar. Another way of looking is saying, now wait, David was not a stupid man. He was a righteous man. He knew the word of God. He obeyed the commandments. How could it be that he was going to count the nation and not do it with the coins? It doesn't say he did it with the coins, but it doesn't say he didn't do it with the coins either. It doesn't get involved in the system that they used, okay? So they say that can't be the case. And what do they say? The problem was there was no need for this count. This was not before a war. This was not after a serious plague. All of David's wars happened at the beginning of his reign. Things are better now. The assumption here is that this would have been somewhere from the middle of his reign towards the end, not at the beginning. And he finished with his needs for an army. So why is he counting them? So what would the sin be here? The sin here would be of arrogance. He was not counting the people for practical reasons. He was counting it to people he could say, wow, look what a nation I command. All these people from Dan to Beersheba, from the east to the west, all these people, I can command such a huge army, and it's a vehicle to boast. I'm the great King David, and this is my army. And that might have been what the sin is, sin of arrogance. And I think that this may be also, if I go back to this idea of, if I go back to this idea of God inciting him or swaying him, okay, I'm wondering, first of all, let's go back to the first question. What was the original source of anger? If you read first verse 1, we have first there's a source of anger. Then God is inciting David to sin. Then there's the sin. So we all just now figured out what the sin was. Okay. So what was the source of the anger? So I mentioned this last week when we talked about the last verse in chapter 23. It's that whole last few verses are lists and lists of the various military commanders of David. The last one mentioned is Uriah the Hittite. And traditional Jewish commentators see this as a hint that this might have been the source of the anger in the first verse in chapter 24. That God is angry at David because he's remembering that sin with Uriah. And the truth of the matter is that David did penance and paid a price for what he did to Bathsheba, but he didn't really pay a price for having Uriah killed. And this might be part of what's going on there. Of course, the problem then becomes, that is David's sin. So why does it say God is angry at David? It says God is angry at Israel. Why is that Israel's sin? Okay. So there's another, if we say, one second. So, and I want to connect this though with this idea of the arrogance we just talked about, okay? Because And I want to connect this with what we referred to at the very beginning of the book of Samuel. In 1 Samuel, there's that section that it's called the ways of the king. That this is in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 11. This is when the nation comes to Samuel and asks for a king, and he really doesn't like it. And he says, I'm going to tell you what these kings do. Okay? And let me see where it is. Verse 11. This will be the practice of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and appoint them. And I'm going to just read some things. Listen to what I'm talking about. He will take your sons and appoint them. They will serve as outrunners. They will have to plow his fields. He will take your daughters as perfumers. He will seize your choice fields. He will take a 10th part of your grain. He will take your male and female slaves, your choice. He will take a 10th part of your flocks, and you shall become his slaves. Every single thing that's going on here talks about a king seizing or taking things that don't belong to him for his own benefit, or it could be for the benefit of the kingdom. But it's more like the king feels that it is his privilege to take whatever he wants. And if you think about what was the foundation of David's sin with Bathsheba and with Uriah, was that he took what he wanted. He acted like this king that Samuel warned the nation about. And David is a righteous king. And yet there's something about being a king, the arrogance that it can cause, that goes to his head, and then he takes. So he helped himself to Bathsheba. And then in order to be able to stay with Bathsheba, he had to rid himself of Uriah. So having Uriah killed is all part of his taking, all part of his arrogance. So that is how I see this going together. So basically, one of the interpretations of this inciting David takes the idea of a Satan not being as an external figure or of even God doing the inciting, but this idea of the Satan as being a reflection of your temptation, of the temptation that comes from within you, what we call in Judaism the evil inclination. The spirit within you that pulls you to do something that is wrong, but what doesn't come out of nowhere. And so if we're saying that David was infected with this arrogance, it would be the most natural thing in the world for him to be incited to count, because it feeds his arrogance. Okay? And so it all becomes part of this picture. It's God that is, in a way, is engineering it, but it's not like God is forcing David to do something. He's basically opening this up before him in a very natural way that is a result of what caused him to deal with the Bathsheba and Uriah thing to begin with. I think that kind of, to me, makes the most sense in looking at this whole thing. And we see, by the way, this kind of, when we study the Book of Kings, it's going to be much later in the Book of Kings, and I'm sure at least some of you are aware of the story with Ahab, who decides to help himself to this lovely vineyard. And when he can't buy it, he arranges to have the guy killed so he can take it. It's coming from the same place. This arrogance that goes to your head as a king. I'm the king. I can take what I want. Okay? Now, here, now going back to the question is, well, what is Israel to blame for all of this? And here I saw a very interesting interpretation that I'd never seen before, and you're going to love this one, Allison, because it dovetails exactly with what you said all along, and I found a source for it in the Midrash. The Midrash says, actually interpreting the, let's take a look at 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 14. Okay. In the morning, and this is all with the Uriah, this is all connected. This is part of the Uriah and Bathsheba thing. And this is what happens how David is the one who sets it up. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, which he sent with Uriah. He wrote in the letter as follows: place Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest, and fall back so that he may be killed. So when Joab was besieging the city, he stationed Uriah at the point where he knew there were able warriors. Okay, and on that verse, there is a midrash, an ancient commentary that said, and actually it's talking about also when David we'll read this in First Kings, when David gives instruction to Solomon to kill Joab. And he said, based upon what Joab did to me. Well, what did Joab did to me? I mean, there's some things mentioned there, but the Midrash here adds something else. That when Joab got this letter, he showed the letter to the other commanders. Now, Allison, you were saying he had the letter and it was an opportunity for blackmail.
Well, yeah, I mean it's power, isn't it? Isn't that a
Right.
source of motivation of human beings, either a sexual motive, a money motive,
Right.
power motive?
Right. So in this interpretation, it said he didn't use it as a method of blackmail, but he actually showed it to the other soldiers. So that, and David found out about it. So he knew he was shamed before those soldiers. Okay. And, or the other generals or whatever. And what that is saying in this context then is that, that is why Israel could be blamed as well, because they knew. At least it wasn't just David and Joab. There was
I'd
other
see it more
generals.
that, yeah, I'd see it more that Joab was protecting himself. Future
It could be.
contingencies, should we say?
No. That's something else. But let's look now at how it relates to this.
Yeah.
How is it that God is angry at Israel or is going to punish Israel on something that was David, if indeed it all connected to Uriah? And that the answer is that at least some of them knew and did nothing. Okay. Now, another interpretation, though, goes in a completely different direction, connects to the first chapter of this last index stuff. Well, we have that terrible story of the Gibeonites and the killing of the five sons, the 5 or 7 actually descendants of Saul in order to appease the Gibeonites. And they're especially not so much the part of the killing of them, but the fact that they were left out without burial for all those months. Ritzpah was the one who's protecting them, and nobody cared. No one did anything. And that's some interpretation said that's where Israel sinned. Nobody in Israel, including David, lifted a finger to bring these people to a proper burial. Okay, so that's also it's an interesting kind of thing. But in both of these interpretations, what they're essentially saying is that Israel is at fault for sins of omission. Okay, that there is a responsibility Israel if they see an injustice to right the injustice. And that's really this message here. So this is where we'll get to this time. We did through verse 10, and next week we will finish the chapter. We will continue with the consequences of the sin and how it leads into the very end of the book. So we will meet again next week. Any questions, comments, anything?
Can I talk about another interpretation?
Okay.
It does actually say that God was angry with Israel rather than David. So what could God possibly be angry about in addition? How about Israel was stingy? They weren't putting their hands in the pockets to bring presents, stuff, what was needed for the building of the temple. David had practically bankrupted himself. I just looked it up. They reckon about $20 billion worth of stuff he'd collected. He couldn't build the temple, but he got it all ready for Solomon. But the country, the people weren't stumping up. So this would be a way, fair means or foul, getting in
Okay.
what was necessary.
Okay, so what you're mentioning, I was going to take up next week. There is that interpretation. It really fits more. It doesn't fit as much here. It just fits more in Chronicles because it's in Chronicles that you learn that David prepared anything. In our book, but it put that preparation aside and how much he spent or didn't spend or whatever, because that's in Chronicles. What you do know in this book, in Samuel, is that David begged to build the temple and he was told no, but his son would. Okay, it's only in Chronicles we learn not only got the materials, he made the plans, he handed Solomon like a builder's kit and said, here, go for it. But that's not mentioned at all here in the book of Samuel. But there is interpretation that just as in general, the sin may have been that they did not yearn for the temple. The only person who asked for it was David. They didn't get involved. They didn't yearn for it. And that, of course, connects to the very end of the chapter. So we're going to discuss all of that next week. Thank you, Carol. Anybody else? Yes.
Oh, I was just going to make a quick comment that it reminds me of the end of the book of Judges where it says men did what was right in their own eyes, because that's the root of a lot of man's problems.
Well, the end of Judges, the context is there is no king. There is no central authority.
Yeah.
So it's anarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if we have that because we have a very strong king. I mean, Saul was a strong king until he started, becoming so obsessed with David. David is a very strong king. He's not perfect, but there's law and order in the kingdom. So I don't know if that really applies here in the same way.
Going back to your point about the plague and the shekel, so it could be about the shekel, but then in verse 13, he's given the choice, isn't he, of famine, fleeing before the enemies, which you could say applies to David and not to Israel as a whole, or pestilence in the land. What do you make of the fact that choice was given there and he said, oh,
we didn't do that yet.
Choose,
we're going to be discussing that next week.
Okay.
We're starting next week with verse 11, and then we'll get to all of that. Okay, great.
I'm intrigued to the idea prophetically that God holds Israel accountable for sins of omission. We could
definitely
take lessons from what's happening right now and keep Israel in prayer.
Well, we do. Look, there are specific commandments that if you disobey the commandments, it's essentially not doing something. For example, any positive commandment, you're supposed to keep the Sabbath. If you don't keep the Sabbath, you will be punished, and that's a sin of omission. You didn't do something wrong. You didn't do something that you were supposed to do. But here it goes beyond the sin of omission in that sense. There's something you're supposed to do, you just didn't do it. Here it's a sin of omission in not stepping up to stop something that was wrong. And I think that's
complicity.
That's even more powerful.
It's the same as
a much higher standard.
Pulling your ox or mule out of your enemy's ox or mule out of a ditch on a Sabbath, isn't it? You still had to do the right thing.
You have to do the right thing, and you can't look at Moses, a perfect example. Moses, when he first goes out of the palace to see what's going on in Egypt and with his brothers, what's the first thing he sees? He sees various examples of terrible injustice, and he steps up. He could have just said, oh, it's not my problem. I'm going the other direction. He steps up. And I think that stepping up is a positive example. If all these people knew what David was trying to do with Uriah, and they said nothing, or in the other example of all these people, their bodies are out there buried. Nobody comes and says, you know what, Ritzpah, let's bury them together. Nobody steps up. So, anyway, that's all for today. We will meet again next week. Same time, same place. And that will be the end of Samuel.